This is one of those kits which Airfix themselves has said is a bit of an outlier. And what we mean by this is that it's pretty much what you see is what you get. There aren't options inside this kit to have further releases in the future in different formats. The subject of this kit was actually a little bit short-lived, so there weren't that many real-world examples and variations anyway. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Airfix Supermarine Swift FR.5 in 1/72 scale. Let's get this one down onto the workbench. So the version I've got here is actually the original release from 2015, so I would have picked this one up shortly after my return to modelling. Airfix did re-release this kit last year, however, and I thought, I've been putting this one off, I probably should just get on with it. So with that in mind, let's get a list of the products that I used during this build up on the screen now. This should give you an idea of the kind of paints and things to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. As is normal, I'll cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutters. Any rough bits of plastic or flash can then be sanded smooth. On the whole, the level of flash is actually quite minimal, so there wasn't that much to clean up on this kit. Tamiya Extra Thin Cement would be my glue of choice throughout this build, and the first steps were to assemble the cockpit. The pilot's seat actually comes in a number of parts which have to be joined together, but sadly there is no pilot included in this kit, so if you wanted one you'd have to source one. After this, I joined together the front landing gear bay and then the air intake ducts. There is a moulded representation of the turbine which can go at the rear of this. These parts are for the air intakes and they were joined together. Once that was done, they could be glued into place inside the fuselage half. I also built up the assembly for the engine exhaust. And now it's time to prime. For the first time. I'm using this K-Colors black primer, and this was sprayed onto all of these sub-assemblies. This primer should act as a good base coat for any subsequent layers of paint to stick to, but also there will be some elements inside the cockpit that need to remain black. With that now painted, there are some decals which need to go into the cockpit area, and I will use Micro Set and Sol as my setting solutions during this build. Having soaked the decals in warm water, the transfers were then carefully slid into place, and I would use the setting solutions to further soften them into the surface of the plastic parts. Vallejo aluminium was used to pick out various details. Here I'm focusing on the rear of the pilot's seat. Vallejo buff would be used on the fabric seat part. Humbrol 25 blue was used to pick out the harnesses moulded onto the seat. With that done, Humbrol clear matte varnish was painted over the parts, which had a slightly glossy sheen, and also all of the decals to help secure them in place. When that was dry, Humbrol 01 primer grey would be dry brushed over all of these parts to highlight the details. Now I can finish assembling the cockpit details. So the seat padding was glued into the chair, and then this was glued onto the cockpit floor. The walls of the cockpit were then built up around the sides of the cockpit floor, and the control panel added at the front. After this, the nose gear bay components were glued into the front of the cockpit assembly. I then added the clear part for the pilot's reflector gun sight. There is also a clear part for the photo reconnaissance camera in the nose, so this was glued in from the inside of the fuselage half. And then there is another clear part which needs to go right at the tip of the nose, again installed from the inside. The cockpit and nose gear bay assembly can now be glued into one of the fuselage halves. This was then followed by the engine exhaust assembly, which is glued into the rear. Because there's no pilot included, I am going to have to display this with the wheels down. So to prevent it from sitting on its tail, I superglued some liquid gravity as far forwards inside the nose as I possibly could. With that done, I joined the fuselage halves together. The fit is quite good, but there is a bit of a seam along the centre line which will need a little bit of work in a bit. The engine air intake assembly can then be glued into place in the fuselage. And now I'm going to move on to the wings. This aircraft comes with an optional belly tank. You can install it or leave it off if you don't want to. But I've actually been inspired by Miss Modeller's musings with magnets recently, and I thought that I'd like to try magnetising it inspired by those videos. This means that I can have it on or off, based on how I feel. So with that in mind, I opened up the hole on the bottom ever so slightly to accept the magnets that I'm going to use. Not enough to go all the way through the plastic, but just enough so that they should help give a strong magnetic effect. Some super glue would then allow these tiny little magnets that I've got to sit into those holes. I found I actually had to stack the magnets too high on the inside here, just so the magnetic field was strong enough. I would also repeat this process and glue some magnets on the inside of the belly tank. After this, the upper wing surfaces can be joined onto the lower wing. But before I join them onto the fuselage, I do actually want to address that seam down the centre line. Some Ammo MIG putty surfacer was painted along the seam and then allowed to dry. The seam is not horrendous, but I think I can make it a little bit tidier with some extra sanding. I did it at this point because it would be easier to do it before I joined the wings. When I'd done that, I carefully joined the wings onto the fuselage and then the rudder onto the tail. I won't actually glue the horizontal tail surfaces on until a bit later after some painting. Flipping over to the bottom of the plane, you do actually get the option to display the landing flaps in a lowered or raised position. I decided I would have mine in the lowered position. The ailerons come as separate parts, which means you technically may be able to display them in slightly different orientations, but I just went for nice and level. And then I glued the landing gear legs onto the landing gear doors. You do get the option to have landing gear raised in this kit, but as mentioned, no pilot kind of means it would be completely unmanned, unless you manage to find a figure from somewhere else. I decided that I would glue into place the landing gear doors and the landing gear legs at this point to get a good plastic to plastic bond. The lower side of this aircraft will be painted the same colour, so it doesn't really matter about painting these separately. There are some little extra details and struts and things, and the landing gear assembly was a little bit fiddly, but with a little bit of care and patience it is possible to get the bits in the right places. I did have to make sure, of course, not to forget to install the door on the nose landing gear bay. I will keep the nose wheel out for now and add it after some painting. Humbrol Clear Fix was used to glue this component into the bottom of the cockpit canopy. I've already painted this in black, as it can be seen through the canopy. I also installed this clear part, which I think is bulletproof glass, into the inside of the cockpit windscreen. Some more clear fits could then be applied to these parts, and they were carefully glued into place on the aircraft. I do have to take care with the glue as it is a little bit stringy, but it should dry clear and not react with the plastic. You can display this canopy open if you would prefer, but I decided I would glue mine in the closed position. I've been fortunate enough to receive a free review sample of the CT scale model's mask set for this kit. I have been enjoying using these products recently and find them to be well designed and perfectly suitable for the job at hand. Of course, all opinions do remain my own, however. I peeled off the relevant masks and then carefully applied them into the correct places. This mask set definitely sped up the whole masking process here. The mask set also comes with little bits of tape to mask the clear camera windows on the nose. The masks don't cover every single bit though, so some Vallejo liquid mask would be used to fill in the areas they don't quite cover. And now it's time to prime, and it's on my t-shirt. I'm going to use this Tamiya Fine Surface Primer in grey. And as it was a nice day, I took the plane outside as well as the parts which have not yet been added to the model, and gave it a few even coats of this paint. After this, I decided I would use some Tamiya paint. I'm going for this ocean grey, and I'll thin it down with some X20A so it can pass through the airbrush much easier. I'm doing things a little bit backwards. Normally I spray the underside of the aircraft first, but actually I'm spraying the top surface, and there is a reason for that. So I sprayed on this ocean grey, and a couple of thin coats would be applied for a nice even coverage. I would of course also make sure to spray certain areas of the lower side. This grey may not be completely accurate for this paint scheme, but I quite like its shade. Another mask set that I've been out and purchased independently is this top-notch vinyl mask set for this specific aircraft. These vinyl masks are pre-cut for the camouflage scheme, so I peeled the ones that I wanted away from the sheet and then stuck them onto the aircraft. It was a little bit confusing, trying to figure out which shapes go where. The instructions weren't as clear as they could have been. But with a little bit of perseverance, it is possible to get these in more or less the right places. However, I did have to use extra bits of tape here and there just to fill in any gaps that perhaps they didn't quite cover. Masks like this are definitely products I enjoy using, as it just makes the painting process a little bit quicker. With that done, and everything now masked up, it's time to move on to the camouflage green. Again, I'm sticking with Tamiya, and I'm going for this dark green. Again, it was thinned down with some Tamiya acrylic thinner, so it could flow through the airbrush a little bit more neatly. Tamiya acrylics do airbrush really nicely, and I'm quite impressed with how these look. When that was dry, I carefully peeled off the camouflage masks, but would need to make sure that I actually mask some of the lower surfaces of the aircraft. This aircraft has a wraparound camo scheme, so it actually goes onto the lower surfaces towards the leading edges of the wings. So I've had to mask these areas, and then when that was done, some polished metal from Ammo MIG would be sprayed onto the lower surfaces. All the lower surfaces are now going to be this colour. I quite like this paint. This was easy to apply, but it did take a little while to fully dry. When it had dried though, I carefully removed the masks that I'd added to the leading edges and also to the other surfaces just to prevent any overspray. And yeah, it's looking alright. This is the kind of thing that puts me off about model kits like this, is the slightly complicated masking that you have to do, but once you come up with a solution for it, it looks pretty good. With that done, I glued into place the tail surfaces, which were painted separately, and now I can move on to the decals. So you get two different paint schemes included in this kit, and I selected the ones that I needed and removed them from the backing sheet. There are quite a few stencils as well, so if you don't enjoy stencils, perhaps you could just leave them off. But I will try and stick them all on. The decals are printed by Cartograph and are to a lovely quality. Just as with the cockpit, I'll be using Microset and Sol as my setting solutions. Microset from the blue bottle would be painted onto the areas where the decals were going to go, and after having soaked the decals in warm water, and as a side note, if you'd like to get your hands on your own brushwater mug, check out my merch store. So once these decals were suitably soaked and removed from the backing paper, they were carefully slid into place in the correct positions. Further coats of the setting solutions would be applied in order to help soften them into the surface details. The decal application went relatively straightforward, if a little tedious due to all of those little stencils. But on the whole, I can't really complain about this step. You'll also probably notice that I didn't actually bother to apply a gloss coat before adding the decals because the paint already seems really smooth and I think it would just be an unnecessary step. Hopefully I don't get any silvering. Once all the decals were applied and completely cured though, I would go over the top with this K-Colors XW30 semi-matte varnish. This should help seal in all the decals and give a nice uniform finish. I'm going to do a tiny little bit of weathering to this kit, but not a great deal. I used a Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash, which I thinned down with quite a bit of white spirit. I don't want the wash to be too dark, all I want it to do is highlight the recessed panel lines and details. So having thinned it down quite a bit, this very thin wash would be painted over the entire aircraft and allowed to run into all of the recessed details and things. This should give quite a subtle effect and just add a little bit of contrast. Other than this, I'm not going to add any further weathering, as I quite like the look of this aircraft in its pristine finish. After this, I removed the canopy masks, and they seem to have done a pretty good job. But the reason why I'm taking them off here is because CT Scale Models has actually included extra masks to allow you to paint the cream band which goes around the cockpit frames. I selected the relevant additional masks for this and added them into place on the cockpit canopy. This was a little fiddly to get things lined up correctly, but with a little perseverance I got where I needed to go. With that done, I would use some pale sand to replicate this kind of cream band around these windscreen parts. I would paint this carefully using a fine brush into the gap between the masks. I could have sprayed this, but it would require a lot more masking of the aircraft. Once that was done, I carefully removed the masks, and yeah, it seems to have done a reasonably good job. It could be a little bit neater, but I think that comes down to my hand painting and perhaps the paint being a little runny and seeping under the masks, but I could tidy it up with a cocktail stick. I don't know if this particular aircraft would have had these bands, but I'm going to roll with it. Moving on to the wheels, I'll use the K-Colors primer again to spray the tyres. The wheels were already painted with the polished metal I used earlier for the underside of the aircraft, and I've masked the hubs. When that was all dry, I glued the nose wheel landing gear onto its leg, and this is the reason why I've left it off until now, because it actually has to be sandwiched between parts, which would have made it a lot more difficult to paint. The main wheels were added onto their legs on the bottom of the plane, and then the nose wheel was installed in the landing gear bay on the nose. There is a pitot tube that needs to go on the wing, but unfortunately the hole for this isn't particularly present, so I did drill that out a little bit and then carefully installed the pitot tube. Some gunmetal paint would be used to pick out the exhaust at the rear of the aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Airfix Supermarine Swift FR.5 complete. And there we have it, that's another build under the belt. Before I get into my build and share my thoughts on this kit, I think it's good to get a second opinion on it from someone else who's also built this kit. This person has built their kit in a slightly different way though, using the other paint scheme that was included. So I'm going to hand you over to Captain VFC. Over to you.
Hello, Captain VFC here, looking to talk to you for a moment about this, the Airfix Supermarine Swift in 1/72nd scale. This is a kit I have recently constructed and I found it incredibly easy to go together. In fact, it was almost too easy. You know, this is a Series 4 kit. I'm expecting quite a few parts, a little bit of complication, and no, it's just an incredibly easy, quick build. So much so that I actually found I needed to do anything to kind of add some details to it. I went for an etched ladder for the crew, so crew access ladder, and I made sure the flaps were down and the undercarriage was down, just to give it as much to help it stand out as an aircraft, because otherwise, well, it just felt a bit too simple, if you know what I mean. The only issue that I had, and I wouldn't really call it much of an issue, was to do with the instructions. They're simple to follow, you can definitely build the model with them, but we've become accustomed to companies, including Airfix themselves, adding in historical information. So scheme A will have this, scheme B will have this. Well, you've got clear parts for the cameras on the nose, there's 3 of them, there's one at the front and there's one on each fuselage half, or you've got blanking plates, and it doesn't give you any indication as to which one is correct. It doesn't say scheme A blank, scheme B windows, or anything like that. It's just, here are some optional parts. A little bit unusual. I just went online and tried to find if I could get any conclusive information as to which one it would be. The short answer is no. Ultimately, you've got to remember that you're making a model for yourself. I preferred the look of it with windows, so that's what I did. In other words, to summarise, a very simple, easy build, but I just wanted to add a little bit more to it because otherwise it was too simple and too easy for the price. Thank you very much to Matt Temp Model Minutes for letting me jump in on his video. Like, subscribe to my stuff if you're that way inclined, and hopefully I will see you again on the internet in the future.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, Captain VFC, and I think it's always good to get a second opinion or look up other reviews on a kit if you're interested in getting it, just to see if people have spotted different things. But on to my review. Yeah, this was a pretty fun kit. I have been putting it off due to the fact that it has that slightly complicated paint scheme and it wraps around underneath the aircraft. Having developed my skills since I bought this kit though, I feel like I've done a reasonable job of this one. I think it's an absolutely beautiful aircraft, and Airfix have done a really good job of capturing the shape and style of the aircraft. If I had to talk about some negatives of this kit, I'll stand by what I said in my unboxing review, and that is the lack of a pilot is a bit of a disappointment, especially given the fact that we do have a raised landing gear option. And eagle-eyed viewers might be able to notice a few little sink marks on the upper wing surfaces, which, whilst not completely visible from normal viewing distances, are a little bit disappointing considering that this was a new tool kit at the time that I bought this. The level of detail was really quite nice, and the fit was generally acceptable, but there were some parts in places that had to take a little bit of persuasion in order to go together. So I do keep a log of everything that I do in my modelling journal, and this is a book that I've created specifically just to help me on the workbench. You just write down, what you're doing and how you got on with it, and if you'd like to get your own copies to work on your own workbenches, then check out my Amazon store. But in here, this kit actually only took me 5 days to complete, so I worked pretty solidly on this one, and I think I made quite quick progress thanks to the fact that I had those canopy masks and also the camouflage masks. The CT scale models masks I really enjoyed, they fit perfectly well, and I don't really have any comments about them because they just work. The top-notch masks though, I wasn't a massive fan. They do work, but I did find I had to do bits and pieces myself anyway, so there was almost a point where you thought, if I have to add extra tape anyway, why wouldn't I just tape the whole thing? Yes, you do get the shapes right with the top-notch masks, but there were bits and pieces which I had to kind of fix. So yeah, I do enjoy using products like this. They make things quicker, they make things more accurate, but in this particular case I didn't find these ones to be quite as problem-free as I would have liked. So another note I've written in my book is that the seam along the center line, whilst it felt smooth running my finger over it, in some lights it does look a little bit more obvious than perhaps it was at the time when I was building it. So again, that's something I would spend a little bit more time working on. And also the paint choices, the grey perhaps is not as dark as it should have been, but I actually quite like how this one looks, and I had quite a nice experience airbrushing with the Tamiya and the Ammo MIG paints. That's pretty much all I've written in here, just not a bad kit. The painting might have been a little bit complex, which put me off, but I've managed to overcome that now. And the final comment I wrote in my book is that it's a pretty nice kit, despite the few small problems. And in the future, I know that this is sort of like a standalone product, and we probably won't see any development of this kit because it can't really be released as a different variant, because the different variants like the F1 or the F7 have different wings and things like that. You can get aftermarket modification parts to replicate a different product, and I would like to see Airfix consider releasing an F1 and an F7, but as mentioned, it would be a completely new tooling, because you can't necessarily just take the existing tooling and change some parts. It would require elements of redesign. So at the time that I'm making this video, this kit was available, or had been available, retailing for £24.99 here in the UK. And actually it was much cheaper when I bought mine. So I've got the original sticker here. So when I bought mine back in 2016 or thereabouts, it would have been originally retailing for £19.99. So it's had a price increase of £5 over the decade. But I actually spent £13 on it. So I kind of got mine like £10 cheaper than it is now. So perhaps, you know, that's like a bit of a warning, perhaps. If you like a look of a model kit, maybe buy it earlier on, because it might end up going up in price over time. I think that the £24.99 that this was recently retailing at is maybe a little bit high. It's not a massive kit, and it only actually comes with 62 parts and 2 paint schemes. So £25, that's putting it on like the same level as like a twin-engined bomber, which, although it's not a small kit, look, it's you know, it's not as small as a prop plane perhaps, but it's still not massive. You know, £25 does seem a little bit high. So I would say if you want to get your hands on one of these, definitely have a look for one a little bit cheaper. But yeah, something else I forgot is I am really happy with how my little experiment with the magnetization went. I didn't expect a great deal from that, but actually that's turned out pretty nice. So now I can display this with the belly tank attached or not attached if I want to. And you wouldn't know that there was a mounting point for it because it's all done by magnets. So maybe magnetizing parts is something I'll explore a little bit more in the future. And I think that's probably where I'm going to wrap this kit up. At the moment, this kit is a little bit pricey, but it's definitely a pretty nice build if you can find one for a cheap enough price. I really enjoy building mine. I'm glad that I've experienced it. But unless there is a different version of it in the future, I would be reluctant to get the same one again. And with that, let me know down in the comments what you think of my build and if my assessment of this kit was fair. As always, quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, check out the links in the description. Of course, there are other ways to help support the channel, and you can find full information below the video. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. I think the penultimate thing I need to say is a massive thank you to Captain VFC for contributing their thoughts on this particular model kit as well, and having done a fantastic job of building it in the alternative paint scheme, and also honourable mention to Ms Modeler for encouraging me to try some magnetisation. But the actual last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll catch you on the workbench again next time. Airfix, where are you? You're over there. Airfix Supermarine Swift, take one. That was alright, wasn't it? That was okay. Oh, phone call. Oh, hello. Airfix Swift, take two. I knew I wouldn't get it in one go. I knew it. I knew I wouldn't get it in one take.
I can't tell if it's a kid shouting outside or if it's the cat. I think it might actually be both, having a conversation.
Before I get into my review and sum up my build, I think it would be good to hear from someone else who's also built this as a